The jungle wasn't supposed to have airfields. It fell hard enough to erase roads overnight. Mud swallowed trucks. Trees grew thicker than enemy defenses. Engineers said aircraft operations here were impossible. Japanese troops didn't care what engineers believed. American infantry were being hunted in terrain where artillery couldn't reach, tanks couldn't move, and aircraft couldn't land. Every request for air support ended the same way. Runway. No landing. No help. So someone proposed a solution so reckless it sounded insane. Build an airfield inside the jungle. No concrete, no drainage, no time. Just steel sheets dropped onto mud, hacked clear by men who knew the runway might collapse under the first landing. They were warned the strip could fail at any moment. Engineers were told not to calculate survivability. Infantry were told only one thing. This works. You live. Know if it would stop or disappear into the jungle forever. Its wheels touched the ground. The war in the Pacific changed in ways no one was prepared to admit. ACT-1, the jungle that killed support. Guinea was never meant to be fought from the air. Not in storms, but constantly turning the ground into something between mud and quicksand. Roads vanished overnight. Trucks sank to their axles. Men slept wet, fought wet, bled wet. Jungle closed in behind them, erasing everything. American infantry units pushed inland, believing air power would save them the way it had elsewhere in the Pacific. Fighters would strafe, bombers would soften positions, medics and supplies would follow. Instead, they found themselves alone. No clearings wide enough for runways. No solid ground that could support aircraft weight. Every request for air support hit the same wall. Zone. No extraction. Chinese units understood this faster than American planners. They moved light, fast, invisible beneath the canopy. They knew that if they wounded a soldier deep inland, evacuation was almost impossible. A single bullet could remove a man from the war without killing him. Jungle became a weapon. Calling for help that couldn't come. Pilots circled above cloud cover knowing there was nowhere to land, nowhere to refuel, nowhere to stay long enough to matter. Fuel ran out faster than the fighting did. Infantry casualties didn't spike in dramatic battles. They accumulated slowly through infection, blood loss, exhaustion, and isolation. It wasn't a failure of courage. It wasn't a failure of aircraft. It was a failure of access. In the mountains, American air power simply stopped existing. When a small group of Army engineers reached a conclusion that went against every rule they'd ever been taught. If the jungle refused to give them an airfield, they would force one into it. Not a proper runway, not concrete, not something meant to last. Just enough ground, just enough steel, just long enough. They asked whether it could survive one landing. As if it couldn't, the men ahead of them were already dead. And so, in a place maps barely bothered to name, engineers began cutting into the jungle not to build something safe, but to build something immediate. What they were about to create was never supposed to work. And that was the point. The engineers did not arrive with blueprints. They arrived with machetes, axes, bulldozers that barely worked, and stacks of steel planking never meant for jungles. What they were ordered to build was not an airfield by any peacetime definition. There would be no concrete, no drainage system, no margin for error. One requirement mattered. Land today. The jungle fought back immediately. Telephone poles had to be cut by hand because heavy equipment couldn't reach them. Roots ran so deep they shattered blades. The ground underneath looked solid until weight was applied, and it collapsed into mud that swallowed boots and tools alike. The rule of engineering said the same thing. This surface will not hold. This ground will fail. This runway will collapse. The engineers changed the rules. The earth, they ignored it. They laid steel matting directly on top of mud, overlapping sheets like armor plates. If the ground shifted, the steel would float. If it sank, the load would spread. It was not strong. It was not permanent. It was barely controlled. Pilots were warned before the first test landing. No second chances. If the strip failed, there would be no rescue. The first aircraft came in low over the treetops, wings clearing branches by feet. The pilot had seconds to decide whether the strip was real or a trap. He touched down hard, brakes screaming, steel plates flexing beneath the wheels. On the ground, waited for the sound of tearing metal. The aircraft stopped. A single landing changed everything. Supplies began arriving that had never been able to reach the front. Ammunition, radios, medical gear. Wounded men were loaded back onto aircraft that only days earlier would have been written off as unreachable. Runway didn't need to survive the war. It didn't even need to survive the week. It only needed to exist long enough to break the isolation. Something new, American units that no longer ran out of ammunition, that could call for airstrikes within minutes, that no longer bled to death waiting for evacuation. The jungle was still deadly. The fighting was still brutal. But for the first time, American soldiers were no longer alone inside it. Because the moment air power touches the ground, even briefly, the jungle stops being a sanctuary. It becomes a battlefield. The Japanese understood something too late. The Americans were willing to land planes on runways that were never meant to exist. And they would keep doing it again and again and again. The Japanese noticed the change before American commanders did. First, patrol reports didn't make sense. Units that should have been low on ammunition were still firing. Positions that should have gone silent after days of isolation were suddenly holding, counterattacking, calling in strikes with impossible accuracy. The air attacks started coming closer. Not distant strafing. No repeated passes. Fighters appearing overhead again and again, sometimes within minutes. Pilots flying so low their prop wash bent the jungle canopy. It wasn't supposed to happen. Protection. Dense foliage blocked observation. Mud slowed vehicles. Distance neutralized air power. Japanese doctrine depended on that isolation. Cut the enemy off. Let disease and exhaustion do the work. The isolation was gone. Landing inside the jungle, refueling, rearming, and returning to the fight before Japanese units could reposition. A patrol ambush that once guaranteed success now triggered airstrikes within minutes. A hidden gun position revealed itself once and was erased shortly after. The jungle stopped being cover. Japanese units tried to adapt. They searched for the runways, but these airstrips were nothing like normal airfields. No towers, no buildings, just steel plates barely visible beneath leaves and mud. Some strips vanished days later, abandoned as the front moved. Others were rebuilt overnight somewhere else. One and another appeared. And the infantry held long enough for aircraft to arrive. First time in the campaign, Japanese commanders faced a problem they couldn't solve tactically. There was no decisive target, no single base to destroy, no infrastructure worth planning against. Americans weren't building airfields to dominate territory. They were building them to erase time. They would stay near the front, shortened battles that once dragged on for weeks. Every evacuation flight returned wounded soldiers who would have died before sunset. Every resupply landing denied the jungle its slow, grinding advantage. Cost was constant risk. Steel plates shifted. Aircraft were damaged on landing. Some crashed. Pilots knew that every approach might be their last, not because of the enemy, but because the ground itself could give way. The system kept working. Not because it was elegant. It was faster than the enemy could react. Understood what was happening. The balance had already shifted. The jungle no longer isolated American forces. Isolated them. The campaign stopped being a war of endurance. It became a war the Japanese could not escape. The jungle did not surrender quietly. Rain hammered the steel strips day and night, loosening plates, turning solid-looking ground into moving sludge. Roots pushed upward. Mud swallowed anchoring pins. Every landing threatened to tear the runway apart. Japanese artillery found some of the strips. Mortars walked across steel mats. Shrapnel punched holes through planking never meant to take fire. Bombs cratered sections that had been laid only hours earlier. Any normal war, this would have ended the experiment. Instead, the engineers adapted. Is the way engineers were trained to. They didn't rebuild for durability, they rebuilt for speed. Damaged sections were ripped out and replaced in hours. If the ground underneath failed, they shifted the strip 10 yards to the left and kept going. The runway didn't have to survive tomorrow. It had to survive the next landing. Aircraft crews learned the rhythm. Pilots touched down, knowing the strip beneath them might not exist on their return. Ground crews worked with engines running, refueling and rearming without shutting planes down. Wounded men were loaded, while steel plates were still being dragged into place behind them. Sometimes the runway collapsed anyway. Landing gear snapped. Planes were written off where they sat, cannibalized for parts and abandoned to the jungle. No investigations, no delays. The strip would be built farther forward. Something the Japanese could not counter. There was no fixed target, no base to plan against. By the time intelligence located a runway, it was already being dismantled or replaced somewhere else. Power stopped being a location. It became a behavior. Began facing a new kind of pressure. They could still ambush. They could still wound. But now every engagement risked immediate retaliation from the air. The jungle, once their greatest ally, offered no warning before engines roared overhead. American infantry, the effect was immediate and brutal in its simplicity. Wounded men stopped dying where they fell. Units stopped running out of ammunition. Patrols pushed deeper because retreat was no longer the only option. Runways kept failing. Not because they were strong, but because the system accepted failure as normal. By refusing to protect the runway, the Americans protected the men who depended on it. And in doing so, they proved something the jungle had never allowed before. Air power didn't need permanence to dominate. Yes. By the time commanders tried to count how many jungle airstrips had been built, it was already impossible. Existed for weeks, some for days, some for a single afternoon. There were no plaques, no maps worth keeping. When the front moved, engineers tore the steel back up, loaded it onto trucks or aircraft, and disappeared deeper into the jungle. Behind them, the rainforest swallowed everything: tracks, scars, wrecked aircraft, until it looked as if nothing had ever been there. It was intentional. Territory. They were moments. Moments when air power touched the ground. Moments when isolation broke. Moments when men who should have died were lifted out alive. Japanese commanders never found a way to stop it, bombing one strip, solved nothing. By the time shells landed, aircraft were already operating from somewhere else. The enemy kept trying to destroy places while the Americans kept exploiting time. Time was the one thing the jungle could no longer control. For the infantry, the psychological shift was decisive. They no longer fought knowing help would vanish. They fought knowing that if they held long enough minutes, sometimes seconds, aircraft would return. That knowledge changed behavior. Units advanced harder. Patrols stayed aggressive. Fear didn't disappear, but abandonment did. Runways failed constantly. Mud swallowed plates. Aircraft crashed. Men were killed building strips no engineer would ever sign off on. None of it was hidden or denied. It was accepted. Designed to protect runways, it was designed to erase isolation. At the end of the campaign, the jungle was still deadly. Disease still killed. Rain still fell. The terrain never became friendly. It stopped being decisive. To the edges of the map had learned how to exist without permission. Not safely, not permanently, but close enough to matter. It was the real breakthrough. Conquer the jungle by defeating it. They bypassed it. That in modern war, control doesn't come from building things that last, it comes from building things that appear where the enemy thinks they can't. The airfields vanished. Because once a military accepts that failure is normal, speed becomes a weapon and isolation stops being protection. A runway that was never supposed to exist ended up changing how wars are fought. The jungle airstrips of New Guinea were never meant to be remembered. They left no monuments. They produced no famous commanders. They didn't appear in victory parades or post-war photographs. Them vanished within weeks, steel mats pulled up, aircraft gone, mud and vines reclaiming everything. By the time historians arrived, there was often nothing left to document. Yet, those temporary runways changed the war in ways far more permanent than concrete ever could. What they destroyed wasn't Japanese fortifications. They destroyed isolation. Terrain decided who lived and who died. Mountains, deserts, jungles, oceans. If you could force your enemy into places where support couldn't follow, the outcome became inevitable. Men fought until they ran out of ammunition, medicine, or strength. The ground finished the job. Guinea was supposed to be one of those places. To hide armies. Wet enough to rot supplies. Vast enough to swallow wounded men whole. It punished logistics more brutally than enemy fire. And for a time, it worked exactly as intended. The Americans stopped trying to tame it. Victories over nature. They were refusals to negotiate with it. Engineers didn't ask how to make the ground stable. Pilots didn't ask whether the runway would last. Commanders didn't ask how long the system could be sustained. Asked only one question. Okay? That single shift from permanence to immediacy rewrote the rules. Once aircraft could land inside the jungle, the ground lost its power to isolate. Wounded men were no longer condemned by geography. Units no longer collapsed because supplies couldn't reach them. Japanese tactics that relied on attrition and exhaustion stopped working, not because they were flawed, but because the environment they depended on had been bypassed. Power stopped being something that arrived from afar. It became something that lived nearby, even if only briefly. Not that they enabled air support, but that they removed the enemy's ability to wait. Japanese units could no longer assume time was on their side. Every engagement risked immediate retaliation. Every ambush risked aircraft overhead before the smoke cleared. The jungle stopped being a shield. And this is where the story stops being about World War II. Airfields is not technological. It is psychological and systemic. Americans succeeded not because they built better runways, but because they accepted something most organizations resist instinctively: failure as a normal operating condition. Runways failed. Aircraft crashed. Steel sunk into mud. Men were killed building strips that lasted days. That stopped the system. It absorbed failure instead of preventing it. It's the lesson that separates resilient forces from brittle ones. Brittle systems demand perfection. They collapse when conditions deviate from planning. They require stability, predictability, and time. Resilient systems expect chaos. They trade durability for speed. They replace what breaks faster than the enemy can exploit it. Jungle airfields were fragile. The system behind them was not. And that difference decided the campaign. New Guinea was still a brutal place. Men still died of disease. Rain still erased roads. The jungle never became friendly. It stopped deciding outcomes. Project power without owning the ground. How to operate without fixed bases. How to make geography irrelevant, even temporarily. The idea would echo forward. Warfare in Korea and Vietnam. It would influence modern expeditionary doctrine. It would redefine how militaries think about access, basing, and time. From runways that were never meant to last is how uncelebrated this achievement remains. Medals were awarded for laying steel on mud. No statues honor the pilots who landed on strips that might collapse beneath them. No famous speeches praise the engineers who built airfields designed to fail. Thousands of men lived because of those choices. They lived because someone accepted that the ground did not need to be conquered, only used briefly. They lived because someone decided that being there, imperfectly, was better than being absent, flawlessly. Is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. Victory does not always come from strength. It does not always come from control. It does not even come from survival. Sometimes, victory comes from refusing to let circumstances decide who gets help and who doesn't. The jungle airfields disappeared. The steel was reused. The planes moved on. But the idea endured. The most important lessons of modern war. You don't have to defeat the environment. You only have to deny it the power to decide your fate. That is how a runway that should never have existed ended up saving lives and changing how wars are fought forever. The jungle was never defeated. This is the mistake most histories make. It did not become predictable. It did not stop killing men. Changed was something far more important. The jungle stopped deciding outcomes. Terrain was destiny. Mountains dictated campaigns. Rivers fixed front lines. Deserts swallowed armies without firing a shot. Commanders learned to respect geography because geography punished arrogance without mercy. Guinea was one of those places. It did not need fortifications. It only needed time. Men rotted alive. Wounds festered. Supplies disappeared into mud. Radios failed. Units dissolved without ever being decisively beaten. Guinea's doctrine understood this perfectly. They did not need to destroy American units. They only needed to separate them from support and let the environment finish the job. Time, it worked. Fields so dangerous as a lesson because they did not solve the problem in a conventional way. Refused to fight it. Stopped asking permission. Every military system is built around assumptions. Some are explicit, most are invisible. One of the strongest assumptions of early World War II was this: prepared bases. Concrete, drainage, security, time. The jungle airfields shattered that assumption. Theoretical, air power does not need permanence. It needs access. That difference matters more than any technical innovation. The Americans did not make the jungle friendly. They made it irrelevant for brief, violent windows. And those windows were enough. Aircraft could touch down near the front. Even briefly, the entire logic of jungle warfare collapsed. Isolation ceased to be a weapon. Delay stopped favoring the defender. Attrition lost its power. The jungle could still kill men. It was abandoned. Why, this was a moral turning point, not a tactical one. The creation of jungle airfields is often described as an engineering improvisation. That description misses the point. It was a moral decision disguised as logistics. Every commander knew what happened to wounded men deep in the jungle. Everyone understood the math. Evacuation delayed was evacuation denied. Support postponed was support lost. Airfields that might collapse meant accepting new risks. Aircraft would crash. Engineers would die under fire. Pilots would land on surfaces that might vanish beneath them. Refusing to build them meant something worse. It would quietly kill men without accountability. Jungle airfields forced leadership to choose visible risk over invisible death. That choice defines serious command. Became the most powerful word in the war. Traditional military thinking values permanence, secure bases, hardened infrastructure, long-term control. Jungle airfields rejected all of that. And that was their greatest strength. Creates predictability. Predictability creates targets. Targets create vulnerability. Temporary systems deny the enemy planning cycles. By the time intelligence identified a runway, it was already gone or about to move. The Japanese kept searching for strong points. Those moments were enough. Attrition warfare. Japanese strategy relied on attrition because it was rational. It required fewer resources. It exploited terrain. It assumed the enemy could not sustain pressure indefinitely. Jungle airfields broke that assumption. Time favors one side. Once American units could be resupplied and reinforced continuously, time stopped being an ally of the defender. Shortened. Engagements ended decisively. Wounded men returned to fight. Units that would have collapsed held. Jungle still killed. Quietly. Why? No one wanted to celebrate this. Fields rarely appear in popular histories. Are uncomfortable. Systems instead of heroes. They emphasize logistics over valor. They reward acceptance of loss rather than avoidance of danger. Expose an ugly truth. Saved by decisions that look reckless on paper. Makes institutions uneasy. Bravery under fire. Jungle airfields celebrate men laying steel in mud under the assumption that the ground will fail. That kind of courage does not photograph well. Or pain. True innovation was not the steel matting. It was the system behind it. A system that assumed engineers would be killed and kept functioning anyway. Resilience. Brittle systems break when plans fail. Resilient systems expect plans to fail. The jungle airfields were never reliable. The network that replaced them was. Why this lesson outlived the war? The airfields vanished. Steel was reused. Engineers went home. The jungle closed over everything. The idea survived. Warfare, in forward arming points, in expeditionary doctrine, in modern distributed basing concepts. Every time a military chooses presence over perfection, speed over safety, access over control, it echoes New Guinea. Environment does not need to be conquered. It only needs to be denied the right to decide outcomes. The final, hard truth. Did not make war cleaner. They made it honest. Men would die no matter what. The only question was whether death would come from enemy action or from delay and isolation. Shifted responsibility back onto leadership. They forced decisions. Not because they were clever, not because they were innovative, but because they refused to let silence, distance, and terrain choose who lived. The jungle never surrendered. At the moments when it mattered most. In war, that is often enough. Controlling the ground forever. You win by refusing to be controlled by it, even briefly. It's the legacy of runways that were never meant to exist. The jungle airfields of New Guinea force us to confront a truth most militaries and most societies try to avoid. Control is overrated. War was about holding ground, building forts, securing roads, establishing bases that proved ownership. Power meant permanence. If you controlled the terrain, you controlled the outcome. Guinea made that logic collapse. No matter how much effort was poured into roads or camps, the jungle refused to be controlled. It rotted supplies, erased tracks, drowned machinery, and killed soldiers who never saw the enemy. The harder armies tried to dominate it, the more it punished them. Americans didn't solve this problem by winning a contest of control. They solved it by letting go of control altogether. They lost the campaign. Early planning in the Pacific assumed that air power, like artillery, required stable foundations. Runways had to be secured. Bases had to be defended. Supply lines had to be protected from end to end. Mindset worked in Europe. It failed catastrophically in the jungle. The cost of trying to secure permanence in New Guinea was measured not in territory lost, but in men abandoned beyond reach of help. Every mile inland stretched logistics thinner. Every delay increased the chance that wounded soldiers would die before evacuation was possible. Americans were not losing because they lacked strength. They rested on certainty. Jungle airfields marked the moment when certainty was officially abandoned. Choosing reach over ownership. Jungle were not bases. They were not meant to be held. They were not defended in the traditional sense. Many were barely marked, poorly camouflaged, and impossible to fortify properly. Existed to do one thing: extend reach for a few critical hours or days. This shift from ownership to reach was revolutionary. This ground, commanders began asking, can we use this ground right now? Single change unlocked everything else. A rear area, they needed proximity. Infantry no longer needed long supply lines. They needed short bursts of access. Engineers no longer built for longevity. They built for immediacy. Jungle airfields were not about winning space. They were about stealing time. Time was the real enemy. Japanese forces relied on time as a weapon. They knew that if they delayed American advances long enough, the environment would do their work for them. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion, with thin enemy ranks without costly engagements. Jungle airfields broke that logic. Close to the front, Americans shortened every timeline. Resupply happened sooner, evacuation happened earlier, reinforcement happened faster. The long, grinding waits that defined jungle warfare disappeared. It didn't make battles easier. And in war, shorter fights almost always favor the side with greater industrial and manpower reserves. Compressing time, the Americans turned Japanese patience into a liability. The uncomfortable trait nobody wanted to admit. Story without acknowledging its cost. Jungle airfields killed people. Stable surfaces. Engineers were killed by artillery and accidents. Pilots landed, knowing there was no margin for error. Runways collapsed. Men died not because of enemy action, but because the system accepted risk openly. It was not accidental. The choice was never between danger and safety. It was between who faced danger. Risk be concentrated among infantry trapped deep in the jungle, or redistributed among engineers and air crews operating closer to support. Jungle airfields spread danger across the system instead of letting it accumulate silently at the front. That redistribution saved lives overall, even though it guaranteed tragedy in specific moments. This is why the decision remains so difficult to celebrate. That leadership in war is not about eliminating death, but about deciding where death falls. Why failure became a feature, not a bug. Traditional military planning treats failure as something to be avoided at all costs. Plans are evaluated by how well they prevent breakdown. Jungle airfields inverted that logic. Runways would fail. Aircraft would be lost. Engineers would die. Nothing would last. Instead of resisting that reality, the system was built to recover faster than failure could spread. A collapsed runway didn't halt operations. It triggered relocation. A destroyed strip didn't end air support. It shifted it. Losses were not investigated before action resumed. They were absorbed and replaced. Mindset expecting failure rather than denying it was the true innovation. It allowed the Americans to keep functioning in an environment that punished rigidity. Why the enemy could not copy the solution? Why the Japanese did not adopt similar tactics? It was uncomfortable. Japanese industry lacked the excess capacity to treat aircraft, pilots, and infrastructure as replaceable. Losses mattered too much. Failure was catastrophic rather than tolerable. Jungle airfields worked because the Americans could replace what was lost faster than the enemy could exploit it. It reveals a deeper truth. Set alone, it is an economic condition. Only a system with surplus can afford to accept risk openly. The quiet death of traditional front lines also blurred the meaning of a front. Air support no longer came from behind secure lines. It came from within contested areas. Bases appeared and vanished. Rear and front collapsed into each other. Confused Japanese planning and undermined their defensive depth. There was no clear boundary where Americans stopped and Japanese control began. Or stopped having edges. Favor the side that can move, adapt, and replace fastest. This story still makes people uneasy. Narratives we prefer suggest that permanence can be weakness. Illusion. Failure can be productive. Unsettling, not just militarily, but culturally. Not solutions that look stable, safe, and responsible. Jungle airfields looked chaotic, dangerous, and reckless. It worked because it implies that many disasters are not caused by recklessness but by an excessive need for reassurance. Lasting legacy. The jungle swallowed the airfields. Steel was reused. Maps were updated. The terrain returned to silence. Lesson survived. Forward arming and refueling points. Concepts. Rapid deployment doctrine. Missionary warfare. Every time a military chooses access over ownership, speed over security, or reach over control, it echoes New Guinea. No thought. Did not conquer New Guinea. They did something far more radical. Control is not required to win. You do not need to dominate the environment. You do not need to hold ground forever. You do not need perfect safety. Sometimes, you only need the courage to let go of control long enough to act. The jungle never stopped being deadly. Decisive. And that is how a runway built to fail ended up reshaping the logic of modern war. 2K Tifkakdi, approximately equal to 2,000 words, a different, bleaker conclusion. Why the jungle airfields exposed the lie at the heart of modern war. The jungle airfields of New Guinea did not prove that war can be mastered. They proved the opposite. War is fundamentally unmanageable, and that survival depends not on control, but on how quickly a system can respond once control collapses. The part most histories avoid, because it is not reassuring. The lie militaries tell themselves. Around a comforting belief. Enough planning, enough intelligence, enough technology, chaos can be reduced to manageable risk. Guinea destroyed that belief. With the jungle. Roads vanished. Radios failed. Maps became fiction. Medical evacuation timelines meant nothing when aircraft could not land. Entire units disappeared from operational awareness not because they were defeated, but because the environment swallowed them. What made this worse was that none of it looked dramatic. Men did not always die in great battles. They died from infection, from untreated wounds, from exhaustion, from simply being too far away. Deaths did not trigger alarms in headquarters. They did not demand immediate decisions. They accumulated quietly, day after day. Quiet deaths are the most dangerous kind because systems tolerate them. Why the jungle airfields were a confession? Airfields in the jungle was not an act of confidence. It was an admission of failure. Planning had limits. Could not be tamed. Logistics could not be perfected, be guaranteed. The airfields existed because commanders accepted something radical, and pretending otherwise was killing people. This is the point where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it suggests that many military disasters are not caused by bold mistakes, but by refusal to admit loss of control early enough. Jungle airfields were not elegant solutions. They were emergency measures implemented after certainty collapsed. This is precisely why they worked. Response. Before the airfields, the U.S. Army tried to prevent failure. Secure routes. Predictable timelines. One of those efforts. After the airfields, the strategy changed completely.